Hey everyone, I'm Joel Pomko. I'm the Executive Director of AIA New Orleans and the New Orleans Architecture Foundation. This is my office, so welcome, I guess, to my office too. I just wanted to sort of make a quick plug for using this space for important conversations like this. I mean, literally at the boots of Lee, we're having this dialogue tonight. So I want to thank you guys for coming out tonight. And make a plug for the Center for Design as a whole. If you think of programming that you would like to have in this space or want to have a conversation here, please feel free to reach out.
Proud to welcome Gia and Sara Zewde. So, or to the AIAS study. They're both very much involved.
Thank you. I just want to make sure, can everyone hear us? Can folks in the back hear? Yeah? Okay, excellent. So I just want to thank everybody for being here tonight, sharing and spending your Thursday night. This is kind of local night, all of you know that, right? So everybody goes out drinking, trying to get ready for the weekend. And we are appreciative that you actually decided to come and have this conversation with us. I'm Gia Hamilton. I am the director of the Joan Mitchell Center here in New Orleans, and just sort of led a multi-million-dollar, multi-year development project in the 7th Ward in New Orleans. And I also am an anthropologist with a curatorial practice. So I've kind of come to this work with lots of different lenses, many of them kind of intersecting. And so I just wanted to start say that Sara and I have known each other for about a decade. And so I kind of watched her grow throughout her academic work and then into her project work. And we were just sort of commenting on the fact that it's delightful when you get to connect with a colleague in the field where you can just sort of literally pick up where you left off with the last conversation. So this really is about you all kind of being a part of an intimate conversation, one that we've been having via social media and emails, both kind of sharing successes and also sort of talking about challenges. And we'll have an opportunity for you to actually listen to the work that Sara's been doing over the past few years. I have some questions for her, and then we're going to try something that's a little bit experimental, and I'm going to ask for your trust and kind of guiding and leading the room. I mentioned earlier to Chris and to Sara that part of my role in spaces like this sometimes is to be a disruptor and to kind of shapeshift things. So I kind of look around to see who's smiling and who's maybe not smiling, and ask that you kind of like stay with us and stay connected throughout the evening. But I think you'll find that it gives us an opportunity to kind of think about these questions and these topics in a different way. So, with that being said, I'm going to formally introduce you. And I always get nervous reading the bios of people that I greatly admire, so I'm going to try to do a good job here. Sara Zewde finds that in considering the relationship between ecology, culture, and craft, there are many powerful departure points for design. Originally from Slidell, Louisiana, Sara is a landscape designer at Gustafson, Guthrie, Nickel, and Seattle, Washington, where she contributes to the design and construction of large-scale civic landscapes around the world. Concurrently, she's working as an independent designer of projects in Brazil and in the southeast of the United States. Pardon me. Sara holds a Master of Landscape Architecture from Harvard University, Graduate School of Design, and a Master of City Planning from MIT, and a Bachelor in Sociology and Statistics from Boston University. Sara was named the 2014 National Olmsted Scholar by the Landscape Architecture Foundation, and a 2016 Artist in Residence at the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, one of our sort of colleagues in the field. Her work was recently featured at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale. So can we please welcome Sara?
Thank you, Gia, for a wonderful introduction. I want to thank Chris and Joel and everybody that's taken part, not only in organizing tonight, but really, I guess, it's being a part of my life in various ways. Growing up in a place like this, you can't leave and work somewhere else and not be bothered by the question of how is it relevant, how is what you're doing relevant to this place. And so I'm, forever bothered by this, and that's kind of why, this is really special to me, this conversation here with all of you. So I will be really anxious to hear from each and every one of you about what's relevant, what sticks, what feels like it's a part of the conversation here. You know, I don't live here anymore, and so just watching from afar what's going on, I'm really curious to get to know the temperature of the city once again. So with that, I will just jump right in. So urban planners and designers have learned a thing or two about cities over the last few decades. Unfortunately for the rest of us, that's largely been through their mistakes. The mid to late 20th century was a particularly harrowing period in urban planning history, with the coincidence of a federally funded program known as urban renewal and the construction of the national interstate system. During this period, what urban planning deemed as revitalization brought devastation to urban communities across the country. And as tends to happen, planners and designers began to recognize the consequences of urban renewal after much of the destruction had taken place. And they continue to self-correct for those mistakes into the present day. So part of that self-correcting, they formed what we generally know as the discourse of community engagement. The planning profession has invested heavily in the development of literature, theory, and methods of public processes and engagement over the last 60 years, as a reaction to the deep-seated mistrust that urban renewal has sowed in urban communities. And this is largely how the discipline operates today. Another part of that self-correcting is a return to the city. After decades of sprawl, cities are making large investments in urban infrastructure, development, and civic institutions in the urban core. And as the critical urgency of climate change continues to come into focus, urban planners will continue to encourage denser, more compact cities. So in theory, this self-correcting should be great, right? And in theory, by now, we should have a highly productive practice of community engagement and public process that leads to innovative solutions. And in theory, this urban renaissance and investment in public spaces and services is something everyone can benefit from. But, you know, you can tell that there is a tension and a frustration with this urban renaissance. People feel like it's not for them. People don't see themselves in the design. And it's confusing for a lot of planners. So let's look at the philosophical underpinning of community engagement. Some of the earliest critiques of urban renewal came from philosophers such as Michel Desserteau and Henri Lefebvre, who declared that people experience space in a multitude of ways. They said space is a social construct produced by one's identity, and this really creates a real perceived experience of urban space. And so their work sought to break down the, quote, grand narrative of the human. And they suggested that one can just assume what's best for somebody and throw it on top of them, which is how urban renewal functioning. So they said, okay, instead of that, let's just ask what people want. And that's the basis of what we call community engagement. The operating assumption here, though, is that public engagement would sort of automatically resolve a lot of the issues. And public process would automatically speak to the needs and desires and cultures of people to lead to the design that is the best fit for those people. The problem with this assumption is that it absolves designers of their responsibility to interpret the histories and cultures of people and design for them in a meaningful way. The problem with this assumption is that it excuses designers of their responsibility to interpret the complex feelings associated with urban spaces and do the hard work of making them beautiful and relevant for people that may not be like them. So if architecture is to have a transformative impact in the lives of people going forward, we must evolve this assumption. The suggestion that there's no further connection between design and culture and a critical thinking about those must be interrogated, because this grand narrative is so deeply ingrained in the way that we are trained to see space that without challenging that, our cultural assumptions will silently guide our practice of architecture and reinforce cultural hegemony of design. So to give you an example, John Gill is one of the most influential urbanists of our times. And one of the ways that he says is to measure good urbanism is how many coffee shops there are per square mile. You know, so these are serious cultural assumptions that we're propagating in the design of cities. And you know, the public is not excusing us. They are trying to articulate it as much as possible. But we're excusing ourselves, and so we have to do our part. urbanists, lambasted the banality and the placelessness of urban renewal, our unchecked urban planner utopia stamped everywhere will also be banal and placeless. Without recognizing these assumptions, we really run the risk of reconstructing that narrative. And I think this is of special relevance for southern cities, where the urban core is deeply tied to complex cultural memory. The urban core of the southern city is sacred ground, sites of trauma, of torture, but also of commemoration and of triumph. Writer Brenton Mock, who used to live here, he writes that the central centrifugal force of commerce that formed the southern city was the shipping and trading of Africans. Africans, therefore, both created the wealth through their free labor, but they also physically built the cities themselves. And despite those contributions to these cities, monuments honoring the advocates of their enslavement were constructed, proliferating across the South in the late 19th and early 20th century, including here in New Orleans, including outside of this window. This period would also see Jim Crow laws draw lines across the southern city, forcing blacks in cities to endure indignities, including restrictions on their movement, minimal city services, and the resulting health and unsanitary conditions and police brutality. In the face of this, black urbanites created self-sufficient neighborhoods, formed their own civic and commercial institutions, defining and designing their own spaces. And these neighborhoods are often located near the central business district, and they still form the basis of history and culture in the southern city today. In New Orleans, Jim Crow squeezed blacks out of the French Quarter and forced them largely to the Treme, the 6th and 7th wards, with the pioneering few later settling in Gentilly and Pontchartrain Park. So Claiborne Avenue became the vibrant center of Black New Orleans as all of these neighborhoods sort of strung along them. And it was home to 200 Black-owned businesses. Its 190-foot wide median was home to the longest stretch of live oak trees in the country and became the lively home of a wide range of everyday uses. Picnics, church events, gardens, gardening, second lining, you name it, it all happened here. But urban renewal first hit New Orleans in 1939, evicting 800 black families from their homes that year to build the then all-white public housing complex of Iberville. The years after that saw a rapid and sustained succession of evictions and demolitions. The next year, from Orleans to Lafitte, cleared for the Lafitte public housing development. A few years after that, another 9 blocks and 410 families cleared to build the Municipal Auditorium and the Haley Jackson Performing Arts Center. And in 1962, an elevated expressway and a series of on and off ramps right through the heart of Claiborne Avenue further dismembered this important street grid. So this is what it looked like in 1960. Here we have 1962, 1964, 1965, and today. In 1977, to add insult to injury, additional urban renewal funds financed a concrete and steel fence separating Congo Square from its people and neighborhood. New Orleans had another chapter of urban renewal in 2005 called Hurricane Katrina. Notably, many other southern cities are vulnerable to this as well. Many of them were located in low-lying ports to take advantage of the transatlantic slave trade, so this is certainly something that's a regional issue. The recovery period following the storm, saw heavy increase in development pressure, and we continue to see that today. So now that we've been through all of that, planners are rethinking everything that they did. And they have their eyes set on the city once again. So cities are making plans to remove Civil War memorials and urban freeways, or the areas cleared for urban renewal they're seeing the potential in spaces once again. Public housing is being reimagined, and we're re-strategizing how we deal with water. All of these will happen, or have happened, or are happening right here in New Orleans. Take them down NOLA, Claiborne, Iberville, Lafitte, reinvestments in Congo Square. It's all happening right now. So this is a critical moment in the history of these spaces, and it points to the urgency with which we need to expand our traditions of design and leverage this moment. And here's really where I situate my work in developing design methods that for a process of what I call interpretation. The idea is that the profession has acknowledged philosophically that people experience space in a multitude of ways. But what are those ways, and how do they generate new forms of design? By focusing on culture as a generator, we move away from operating from a place of guilt, and instead we operate with the recognition that there is a latent genius in cultural memory. So I propose 3 departure points for this process. The first is time. Henri Lefebvre, one of those philosophers, he asserts that time is a critical 4th dimension to establishing place consciousness. So any redesigning of space with cultural relevance requires an intimate insertion of time. And the arts, including the performance arts, have historically been very accessible with low barriers to entry. So they form the roots of many oral traditions, and as such, this should be considered a registration of spatial vernacular and spatial design traditions. And all of this feeds delineation, which is what architects probably are the best at engaging with, is how do people use space? How do they negotiate between indoor and outdoor, between private and public, between different types of uses? But the framework is understanding space should be couched and nested in these other understandings of culture. So I'm going to run through 2 projects I've worked on in other cities with this sort of framework, and then we'll bring it back to New Orleans and have a conversation about that. The first is Houston, Texas. This is Freedmanstown in Houston, a neighborhood constructed by freed slaves in 1866 on a swampy backwater that was then unwanted. Its location on the soggy southern banks of Buffalo Bayou, its flat topography, and impervious clay soils made the site prone to frequent flooding. The banks of the bayou were lined with tall and gnarly grasses, a haven for mosquitoes. These unpalatable attributes were the reason it was still available for settlement the year of emancipation. So the first freed slaves departed the Brazos River cotton plantations, and they entered Houston through the west. So this is a map from 1873, and we're looking south. They would have entered along that red dotted line. Well, along that line, within that circle, you see a few small structures, and that represents their settlement. They cleared the muddy land, they constructed their own homes, they made their own bricks to pave their own streets, they provided their own services and utilities, all things the city at the time refused them. They designated some lots remain unbuilt to mitigate flooding, and the same lots that were held for flooding mitigation were also had a dual purpose of preaching. So they used shrubs and twigs from the bayou to set up these brush arbors as places of gathering and worship and water. Quickly, Freedmanstown became the heart of civic Black Houston, home to teachers, shop owners, lawyers, and doctors. Over time, a series of traumas have continued to wipe away these structures and the people in them. A freeway bisecting the neighborhood, large-scale urban renewal projects, and of late, extreme development pressure given its proximity to downtown. The increased urbanization of the area worsened the flooding issues and water quality in the bayou. So through a series of planning efforts, people stated definitively that they want to upgrade the neighborhood's infrastructure. But they also wanted something that speaks to the culture and the history of the place at the same time. So people, at the time I was working for a landscape architecture office, and they were contracted to do the design of one of these streets. So in this image you see on the left, the historic fabric of the neighborhood, and on the right, where a lot of the blocks had already been cleared. And our project was to design the streets as they were redoing some of the infrastructure. The original scheme that the office came up with was, they were like, okay, well, let's put African symbols in the paving everywhere. This is the level of discourse we have. So I took this moment to trace the architectural typology in the neighborhood, and I traced it back to West Africa, brought to Haiti by enslaved peoples who fled to Louisiana during the Haitian Revolution, from where it spread to the bayous of southeast Texas. These structures had windows going down the lengths of the building and no hallways, which meant that every single room had excellent cross ventilation, which is important if you live in the tropical, subtropical climates of West Africa, of Haiti, of New Orleans, or of Houston. You'll also note that by orienting the shorter end of the home along the street, the settlers achieved a greater density of facades on each block, which had a profound effect on the social nature of the The facades were in alignment with one another with virtually no setback. And there was this sort of ubiquity of the porch that created a gallery of spaces that puncture the streetscape. They blur the delineation between private space and public space. We see this a lot in Orleans. This public offering of the private facades was intimately tied to people's association with this place. So I studied them. I went out in different seasons and times of day to record the qualities of light while some of the structures still remain, noting the patterns created by the stairs, porches, windows, and drawers. I took note of the paving pattern the original settlers laid. You'll note that along the roadways, on the top two images, there's this sort of orthogonal pattern of the bricks. But at the intersections, they break and they form a diagonal. And the sort of urban legend in the neighborhood is that this was a West African tradition, and it was used to highlight an intersection as a place of ritual, as distinct from the roadway. So I recognize this as an opportunity to frame our street in a similar way, incorporating what was left of the historic bricks and sort of concentrating them in the intersections and elevating their profile, abstracting the dimensions of the historic structures with a series of black concrete panels, their color and material signifying the modesty of the structures. You know, the idea was not to summarize the past on a plaque or in a statue, but it was really tying into African American philosophies of time, which are largely influenced by a circular notion of time. The future is the future, but it's composed of pieces of the immediate past and present. So the idea is to offer a new public space that aimed to invite the uses, the interaction and the intimacy that has borne witness to over time. So to this end, I simulated both sunlight and artificial light, testing the shadow patterns that these panels would create on the street. I proposed using the actual wood panels from the structures to form the concrete walls, such that the concrete would become casts of the structures, sort of creating an imprint of the frame. The planting would be central to providing shade in the Houston heat, but also to the spatial narrative. The leaves of the tall grasses, banana plants, fishtail palms, and weeping willows stretched through the cut-out doors and windows. The thick, heavy swampiness, speaking to the bayou edge that the settlers originally cleared. So once we demonstrated our intent to incorporate culture in this way, we were actually given the opportunity to explore adding an additional block to the design, which is the area that you see called Sanctuary. And we decided to hark back to the old lots that held water for preaching. The design here proposes a curbless street profile and rain gardens such that stormwater could be managed and water quality ameliorated. And a set of wooden trellises to mark the space for larger gatherings, much like the brush arborists once did. So, you know, as landscape architects, we were asked to put curbs and benches and trees in a line, basically. And we did all of that. I mean, we did our job, but interpretation would allow us to evolve that form and engage with the neighborhood spatial feature in a productive way. So let's go to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This is the Valongo port, Cais do Valongo. It's depicted here in a painting entitled Desembarque, which means arrival in Portuguese. The painting is called Arrival because this was the point of arrival for millions of Africans brought to the Americas. An estimated 22% of all Africans brought to the Americas via the transatlantic slave trade came through Rio de Janeiro. So this arrival point is significant not only for Rio, or not even just for Brazil, but really for world history. And as slavery would become more lucrative, investors decided to upgrade this wooden deck to a stone jetty in 1811. Those investors made a good return on their investment because in only 20 years, the first 20 years of the stone jetty, over 1 million Africans walked across those stones. So this is an image of the bay the year before the slave trade was made illegal in 1888. We can't know for certain that all of those ships have Africans in them, but we know the scale of the industry. We know this is what this port was for. So you get a sense of the scale here. Keep this image in your mind as I move to the next map. So that image is atop this hill overlooking the water. This line here that you see kind of floating across was the historic coastline. And over a number of years that there was a number of field operations that moved the coastline further and further out to that outer line that you see. So that effectively covered up the port and made it entirely out of view, building a city on top of it. So that was until 2011, when the city began upgrades to the sewer system downtown to prepare for the World Cup and for the Olympics. In doing so, the construction workers found the ruins of the stone jetty, surprisingly very well preserved below the street. So in response to this, the activists basically required that the city do something. So the mayor was in the newspaper saying, okay, we're going to design a memorial that represents the Black experience. So when this happened, I was living in Rio, working as a planner, but I was about to move back to the US, but the story kind of haunted me, and I decided to apply for a grant to go back to Rio. My proposal was supposed to be a 2-week research project, light analysis, but some of the interviewees, asked, could you be involved? Do you want to talk to the city about this? So I ended up in the mayor's office, and long story short, they were like, could you design this? So, okay. Going into it, I knew what the city, basically had in mind. The typology of the memorial is rooted in a notion of monumentality from ancient Roman and Greek empires. They're fashioned around the notion of an event, a war, a hero, a triumph, a tragedy, to trigger emotions outside of the everyday. So even though their forms change over time, a lot of the spatial traditions that they're associated with remain. So distance, slowness, walking, guilt, sort of a regulation of your body and how you interact with this thing. No matter what form they take, that remains constant. So I'm going to take a moment to run through this a little bit because I know that this is a topic of relevance right now. This is the sort of the monumental roots of what we know as a memorial, and what better place to be having this conversation? We know this form well. Following the end of the Civil War, a period in history known as statue mania begins, and we also know that form. A lot of equestrian statues, the pedestal form still remains. So the way that you interact with this thing is still the same, but it's all about the monumental figure. And then the City Beautiful movement happens all across the city, across cities around the nation, and they basically calibrate entire streets to these monuments. Ground treatment is very minimal. It's all about the view and passing by it. And then we get to a period in the 60s and 70s where there's sort of these abstract representations. This is sort of ushered in by the public art and land art movements, where you are meant to, the viewer is meant to project their emotions onto an abstract thing. Now it's all about the ground. This sort of abstract idea of the monument is flipped over on the ground, and you have this monument on the ground. And really today, where we're at in terms of that evolution is sort of a mishmash of everything that's happened so far. This is the grand narrative of the memorial, is that, the spatial conditions really of the monument hasn't really changed that much, and how we engage with them. So much so that even memorials that speak to slavery or anti-memorials, they tend to co-opt the same forms of those, of this sort of European-rooted traditions of monumentality. So this grand narrative is so grand, that we can't break out of it, it seems. This is a problem because this architectural form is really based on the idea of an event or a discrete moment in time. It doesn't really resolve the fact that slavery was 400 years of the way the world operated, and its effects are still present today. So this really became an opportunity to revisit a process of interpretation. Many Black cultures of Brazil are also rooted in a circular notion of time. So, looking back some 300 million years, we see that the slave wharf, marked by the black dot, actually touched the coast of Southwest Africa 300 million years ago. So their soil profiles are relatively similar still, and it's a red red lattice to like tropical soil, and they share a lot of the same floristic characteristics. So on this map, you see the slave trade routes in light gray, and the shared soil region in the same color, and the spread of plants and cultures in between them. The Africans actively brought plants with them on the ships, which flourished in the Brazilian landscape, and they were further used to reconstruct many plant-based rituals. So you also see here the dominant warm and cold ocean vectors atop the slave trade routes. So, you know, some of the plants that are shared between these continents, they actually made the same trip, but before the Africans arrived. They evolved flotation devices and landed in the New World. So when the Africans arrived and they saw the red soils and they saw those plants, it said that they knew that their gods, or their orishas, were present. So it's interesting to note that New Orleans is very much a part of this constellation, both in terms of the slave trade route, but also in terms of the soil. So this is the view, sorry, let me take a step back. This black dot here is the wharf that I showed you. So if we zoom into that dot, this is basically what you would see. This is the view that the Africans would have had seeing those plants for the first time. So you get a sense here of the scale of the infrastructure necessary to support the buying and selling and storing of millions of people. So the way this works is you arrive at the port, that sort of piece sticking out into the water is that stone jetty. If you were sick, you would make a right down the street. And this is an open burial ground where if you didn't make it, you were thrown. But there's a slave hospital there too, where they would try to make you better, to get a better price for you before you're sailing. If not, you would keep going down the street to a triangular plaza, known as the deposit. So you would stay there for 2 to 3 weeks for fattening and taming. And during this period, you're likely to be stored in one of these warehouses lining the streets. So this whole industry required a lot of space. In fact, it required an entire neighborhood. And much of it was in the form of small pieces in the city. So I linked that analysis, which you see at the bottom here, to the contemporary city fabric, which is in the middle, and found that a lot of these spaces still exist without any marker or designation noting the history. So at the top, kind of cut off a little bit, is taking that analysis and including a layer of redevelopment. The mayor had a huge redevelopment plan in the port zone, so a lot of these parcels were available. So the idea here is, why don't we expand the idea of the memorial? Where can we expand to? How big of a scale can we really work with? And so that top layer is really the first step at really understanding the scale of this project. So with the 3 points of interpretation in mind, I looked to the diagram as a form of exploring the spatiality of time and arts and delineations. So all of these are trying to map out and diagram how people use space culturally. So I'll give you a sense of how that works. So here we're looking at the movement of bodies and urban spaces are taken over to the calculator. So this is a diagram of one of the spaces and how people are using it as a sort of an indicator of the design intentions of the tradition. So this idea, is really reinforcing the notion that the design of the memorial should be not in an object, but really in a way that supports the movement of these bodies. That memory is embodied in the uses of the spaces already. And so what can we do to support those uses? So I designed not a discrete memorial, but rather what you're seeing here. It's sort of a master strategic plan of a constellation of designs that are interwoven into the everyday spaces of the city. This resulted in eight concrete designs that the city could include in their redevelopment plan, each anchored to spatial traditions, but also using some of that vegetation brought from Africa as elements in their design. So when we first proposed this to the city, we were told that we were actually not allowed to plant these because they're non-native to Brazil. But the very concept of native vegetation in the Americas is based on what plants were there when the Europeans arrived, which is a pretty arbitrary moment in the constant migration of plants. So, using some of the same maps that I've shown you here today, we basically were able to convince the city to relax this regulation for us and continue on, based on the fact that these are well adapted and flourish in Brazil, and let alone, giving credence to the spatial, their significant historical and cultural relevance here. So let's go through a couple of the designs, and we'll talk about how this process hit the ground. So let's start at the archaeological site itself, which is that sort of half circle piece. An interesting thing to note, this is a monument to one of the Portuguese empresses, which would be the equivalent, I guess, of a Civil War memorial here. And it was built atop the slave port on purpose, kind of to cover that. And the activists, they tried to have it removed, or at least moved over to the side. But the city said that the Portuguese empress was also part of the history and should stay. So the group was, like, okay, so let's design something that's like taller than it, so that it kind of wins. So we kind of like beat her. So, my entry point to that conversation as a designer was to say, like, height is a demonstration of power in a European tradition of monumentality. What are some African traditions of demonstrating power that we can draw from and have a more powerful dialogue? So that really became the guiding sort of framework for us. So through a historical mapping, also we found that, so this box is that monument, and the sort of sprinkles around it are the archaeological site. Through mapping, we found that the wharf was actually much larger than the archaeological site. And so we proposed a land parcel swap between the trash reciprocal that's located on the slave port and this vacant land over there to expand the design, and also make the entrance into the favela the central entryway, noting that many of the residents of this history currently live in the favela. Also, we identified the ficus genus as being native to both continents. Afro-Brazilians believe that the base of this tree is the place where the ancestors gather. So the tradition is to mark that through a wrapping of white fabric or white walls around the base of the tree. So I explored this form in plaster to kind of see, what could that mean urbanistically? What could that do for us? So the idea in the design was to physically make that the circulation system that links the favela all the way to the sea, and forms these sort of circular spaces that would support a lot of those rituals that took place, like in the diagram, in a circular way. There is a planting of ficus around the base to provide shade, but also to mark where the ancestors gather, and in that way we're sort of, shrouding over the Portuguese monument. So, as opposed to the sort of box form that an archaeology site normally takes, the idea was that the wrap sort of smudges the boundary between archaeology and the city, and between past, present, and future. So let's look at the space at the top, which looks out over the sea. What you have today are a series of underutilized warehouses owned by the city. So I proposed removing the warehouse that aligns itself with the end of the African journey to Brazil to reconnect this constellation to the sea. A lot of Afro-Brazilian rituals are about water. And they activate a lot of spaces. You hear and see them around town. But the bay here is extremely polluted and dangerous to touch. So how do we design a place that would allow those activities to take place here without the bay? So I proposed a plaza that basically would feature a scrim of water of about ½ inch depth that would create a surface that reflects the sky. So this reflection would create sort of a sensation of infinity because it's out over the water. And it would be activated by Afro-Brazilian rituals. It would offer a microclimate that was refreshing to urban dwellers. The average person walking by, the average child, the children living in the neighborhood, this offers a sense of play and kind of links that sort of everyday with memory. I'll take you through an urban design move for the historic coastline. The concept for this street really came from this reflection of this idea that the land masses were ripped apart, the continents were ripped apart and stitched together and in different ways. And so Brazil has a very intriguing history of using bold geometry in their post-colonial architecture. Think Burle Marx, think Niemeyer. So this sort of language kind of fits in with the heritage of the urban landscape. And so by proposing to downgrade the vehicular traffic and privilege one side of the street, we were able to create this sort of zipper pattern down the side of one of those and kind of have this sort of African vegetation ripping through the seam of the zipper. And so this creates a pattern that can be illuminated at night and visible and legible from the favelas above. So I'll show just one last one, and that is the historic Quilombo at the top of a hill nearby. So the problem with there's the Quilombo, and then there's this the deposit where people were fattened and tamed for weeks. And in plan, looking from above, they're very close to each other, but there's no way to get in between them because of the intense topography. So the idea was really to just stitch them together through a series of paths, plazas, and stairs that would offer moments of reflection looking out into the landscape. So this is a new sectional relationship between the Quilombo, this historic building the city owns that was an old samba school, and the deposit itself. There's a lot of African vegetation already on the hillside, volunteer species. So the idea was really to just have this insertion and highlight their existence. And those same species have already overtaken this historic building. So making a public space out of that old building is simply about curating the presence of this plant. And then so for, around the neighborhood, creating a motif that would tie the story together for visitors. I really drew from the idea, went back to the rack, and proposed some site furniture made out of concrete impregnated cloth that would serve as a bench for people in the neighborhood, offer inscriptions, have planting, and kind of bring everybody together and orient people in a way as well. So, to stitch together kind of creates a motif for the neighborhood. Kids can still play in these spaces, it doesn't have to be this chained up thing, but it's part of the neighborhood and yet still allows you to engage with the history. So, the design was territorial in scale. I was working with a large-scale model to understand the relationship between these sites. So here you see the wrap around the archaeological site, its entrance into the favela. You see the graphic of the zipper going down the historic coastline. The constellation goes all the way up to the top of the favela, from where you can see at the top there the plaza with the scrim of water overlooking the bay. So, this project was really just about highlighting things that are really already there. It's about creating a context for the history and for the life that we see every day. It's about validating these things. It's really about saying that the memory of these places exists in the people, and that's part of the tradition, and that's relevant. So that brings me to New Orleans, the hardest. And this is really where we can start to open this up for reflection. These are my sort of first take thoughts after working through all those projects and then thinking about this place. Black Louisianans played a major role in developing the spatial traditions of New Orleans. the majority of the Africans that the French imported to Louisiana were funneled through the Senegambian region and the Bight of Benin from the interior of those areas where cities had been built for 3,000 years, in and along rivers and deltas, much like New Orleans. And a lot of those cities were actually more urban, more populous than New Orleans in the French period. So they brought those skills with them when they came here. And the arts have been the tool with which people have really carved spaces of independence and action and freedom in this city. Musical traditions, styles and traditions of commemoration. I think Congo Square is relevant to this conversation. The fact that people have been congregating here since at least 1724, and ironworking and painting and tile setting. All of these traditions were actually ancient crafts from the Senegambian region that were brought here, and they enriched the streets of New Orleans. So, thinking about how these things are a registration of spatial vernacular in New Orleans. The street is the stage for the collective performance of life in this town. And much like in Houston, the shotgun home has had a profound effect on the social nature of the street. I love this diagram by Richard Campanella about how the downtown neighborhoods on the bottom here have this forthright orientation to the street, and how in some of the uptown neighborhoods it's a lot more about having a private space. But what the downtown neighborhoods do is they really energize the public spaces and the public realm. That's why the neutral ground is so critical, and why porches and streets are so critical, is because the shotgun is really a shot of energy into the public realm. So I love this painting under the bridge of the two women talking. So in New Orleans, outdoor private spaces are gardens, porches, and stoops, but they're seen as extensions of the home. I think that's what this painting does so well. Is the bedroom of the architect of the shotgun is the circulation system. So it's a whole other definition of private and public. How do we draw from that now that we have this opportunity today? So businesses along Claiborne, they see the sidewalk as an extension of their space. People consume right outside the doors, and there's this fluidity. I think there's something that the urban public realm can do to speak to that and support that. And so I just want to open it up to the conversation about now. What do we do now? A lot of this, I think, is causing frustration. I get from urban planners all the time, with the Claiborne piece, there's some hesitation from the community about taking it down. And planners ask me, why don't they want their neighborhood to do better? And it's there's a lot of emotional attachment to this thing that was forced on people. People associate, a lot of the traditions, even though they took place before the construction of the freeway, they associate the culture with the bridge, right? So how do we design for that? They've assigned value to the shade of the bridge and the acoustic qualities of the concrete, and the processional-like gallery spaces that the columns create. So how do we draw from that? Even the paintings now under the bridge have their own value. How do we design for that? It saved people's lives, and that's a part of the emotional attachment to this structure. Is there a way that we can speak to that? Rudy Lombard, who is was the late Rudy Lombard, was a local civil rights leader. He said, I feel like I never see nooses and chains anymore, and it's as if slavery never existed. And if they take down the Claiborne piece and don't have any of it left, it would be as if that never happened either. And so, how this is a rendering from one of the feasibility studies that we've done recently. How do we speak to these valid and real experiences of the structure? How do we? This is a quick sketch of just do we take pieces of the structure? Do we layer in, forms of water management into this 38 acres that opens up into the middle of the city? How do we piece these things together, and do we offer, shade and acoustic support through a building of a new structure that, somehow supports the space in the same way? And so this is really, I'll just close on this and to say that I think that cultural memory can power how we design now. So this is really a call, especially to the designers, to say like, we should be doing the hard work of interpreting, of looking at people and recognizing the latent genius in their traditions, and how do we use that to solve some of today's most urgent urban design challenges. So, thank you.
I think we should take a deep breath. That was, you took us all around and connected it, and I was sort of taking notes continuously. So you and I have known each other for almost a decade, and again, I think it's important to kind of start or center this part of the conversation around bringing our whole selves to the work that we do. And I'm just I'm curious, as like a female assigned person of color, how you're navigating these conversations in spaces where this idea of cultural memory, this idea of equity is new, and or may even be receiving some pushback. So how do you navigate that in your body, in your skin, your memory, professionally?
You know, I guess my family and this place has always taught me that our culture is rich, and so in the face of being trained as an architect and a planner, where that's not necessarily credited, I've always been operating in this like weird space in architecture, trying to resolve what I feel like I know with a professional training. And that sort of resolution, I hope, is productive, and that's really how I've had to center myself, given who I am, is trying to resolve the spaces in between what Du Bois calls the double consciousness. That is really productive, and I think design as a discourse can benefit itself from that. And it's that belief that like keeps me going, even though that I don't see myself in the way that I've been trained. I think there's a lot of work and innovation that can come from knowing that and coming from the place that I'm coming from. That makes sense.
Absolutely. You sort of in your lecture there's sort of a call to action, right, of planners and designers, and I'm wondering if there are any takeaways that you feel like specifically for people who maybe don't have the cultural background, right, to draw from in terms of the richness, even though they may be working in spaces that are very different than their own cultural upbringing. So what are some of the ways that you can kind of put on a different lens, or tools and ideas and ways to kind of think about the work differently?
Yeah, it's a call because I'm not one of those people that says like you have to be from that place to design it. I'm not from Brazil, even in my professional day-to-day life, I work on designs in places around the world, and that's why I feel like the call is really to develop methods, and that framework, as philosophical as it got, was really about like, I think that design can do it if we invest in the discourse and in the methods. I think that we can design, the whole idea of design is you have to understand the person that you're designing for, how they value the space, how they use it. But in a lot of ways, particularly with Black culture, it's often regarded as a tradition of, the coping mechanisms of marginalized people, and the potential is not recognized. And so the methods, articulating methods is a way to have community members also understand our process, our cultural assumptions. I think the methods piece is big. The drawings, the diagrams were really useful for, the group I was working with in Brazil, when they saw that animated diagram, the faces lit up, and maybe that doesn't make sense to you guys, but maybe that's okay, because it totally made sense to them, and they were like, oh, that's us. that's how it works, you know, like, and that's how it's translated into the design, and it's not my culture necessarily, but it really became this platform for us to exchange, and I think designers, whoever you are, can do it if you do it.
So, you know, so you just mentioned Brazil, but bringing it back to sort of New Orleans and this proposal for the Claiborne corridor, you know, I remember talking to my father about the importance of that corridor and other Black spaces where Black businesses kind of anchored residential neighborhoods, right? Became, you know, these spaces where Black culture was highly adaptable and flexible based on what was currently happening in the financial world and right all around. And I wonder where the concept of equity comes up for you in thinking about this. Right, because I've been really curious about how, as designers, planners, thinkers, developers, how we're thinking about designing in a space that might not be for the people who currently live there, right? And embedded and displacement and discrimination. So, as you're thinking about this, how are you thinking about equity and displacement and gentrification in these conversations?
As a landscape designer, like, I know what my skill set is and where I can help, and I know that there's planners and policymakers and, you know, institutions that I work alongside and I see myself in parallel with. But my role is, you know, the way I see it is to support the conversations and the sense of ownership and belonging that we should have over these spaces. But I know that designing the public realm may not necessarily be a direct link to, you know, making housing more affordable, you know, but I coordinate with and work alongside people that are working towards that. And while equity tends to focus, the discourse of equity tends to focus a lot on policy and financing, I guess the way I see it is I'm working towards the equity of delight, towards the equity of comfort, towards the equity of culture, towards the equity of, you know, feeling like you belong, towards the equity of, like, these other maybe not measurable things by statistics, but are important too. And so I see this as supporting the, you know, I don't even like to use the word gentrification, but the rapid change that takes over a lot of our most historic and sacred spaces. But I work alongside it.
Yeah, so it sounds like, you know, there's this continuum that you're operating within, depending on who the stakeholders are.
Yeah.
And I've been kind of thinking about this idea of, like, moving at the rate of trust, right? And, right, this idea of, like, how do we build trust and a kind of shared vernacular. And so, you know, some of what you have shared with us tonight may seem very radical in some spaces. And so how do you navigate those conversations where you're sort of talking to community members, but you're also talking to the mayor, right? What does that look like in terms of process and methodology?
I love the rate of trust, because that's slow. And that's the problem with gentrification in my mind, is the rate of speed. Because a lot of the processes that have been most damaging to urban communities are processes that happen rapidly. And so I think scale and speed is really important for a lot of these projects. If you notice, like, a lot of the proposals are small insertions. And that's purposeful in a way. The continuum is an interesting one. I think a lot of designers can relate to that in a way, but I did a lot of, you know, I had to align myself with the mayor's office in a strong way, and I had to align myself with the community groups and the activists. Who, you know, these two groups are often in tension, but it's a lot about relationship building, and designers have to do that a lot. We do a lot of negotiating. It's a special dance and a lot of code, but it's productive, and I think it's also productive for the process of design, of, like, incorporating all different aspects and elements of understanding space.
I wanna kind of go over the concept of code switching, and of course double consciousness, which people of color are very familiar with. How does this translate into part of a method for a designer, right? This need to code switch, to actually be able to speak to lots of different people and to translate sort of design vernacular to the person who might be using that
Yeah.
space.
It's funny because code switching is often associated with linguistics. And so, can your design code switch? And that's really, I think, what I am fascinated by is, the benches, the wraps, these things, the water closet is a place of play, but it's also something very sacred and has to satisfy all of these things. And so I hope that design itself, the designs that I work with are doing the code switching in a physical way.
When I think as a practitioner, the work that I do within an institution and then the independent projects that I take on, there's sort of a reason right now in this world as a professional that it feels important to me to have these concurrent practices. One offers me access points and resources. The other offers me a high degree of sort of flexibility and adaptability within my practice. How are you negotiating both working with a firm and then also taking on practices, your own projects, and what are the kind of different approaches? Do you approach them all the same way? Or?
So the firm that I work for, I had to work for them because I feel like there are very few offices that they would even care that I talk like this.
And I'm not sure the name of the firm.
They just completed the landscape for the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. They're doing India Basin, historically black neighborhood park in San Francisco. They're doing all these really incredible civic, public landscapes. So in part, we share a process, and that's why I wanted to work there, so that there's continuity from my day to my night. But also, I think it's a lot of people, a lot of designers that are, interested in communities and social impact. Sometimes the actual quality of the design in a physical form, I'm talking construction, detailing, and that kind of thing, sometimes gets lost in the mix. And so, I see myself in learning from the best and wanting to, how does this stuff inform how we detail a corner? Or, what does that mean for a joint? How do these things really, what is the scale to which this could be relevant and provide a platform for innovation? I see it happening there, it happens, and I, really want to understand the construction process itself in order to see this concept through all the way to innovation. So to me, it's fluid.
It sounds like so much of your work, you're approaching it both with questions, through this slow process, with observation, with historical sort of gathering of information, but also with just committing to the idea of talking to people and really listening. And so one of the things that I really wanted us to do tonight is take a couple of questions from you all, but also to maybe kind of shape-shift this room to allow us all to kind of be in a reflective space and to engage in a process that's called a kaleidoscope conversation. And if you've ever done a kaleidoscope conversation, it sounds overly simplistic in that you get to pose questions but not answer any of those questions. And one of the things that we found in doing these kaleidoscope conversations is that it actually allows for more equity within the room. It allows us to be more reflective collectively, and also to pose sort of critical feedback through the form of a question without it being just overtly invasive and intrusive. And so I would love to kind of open this up a little bit, take a couple of questions, and then maybe move to this collective process that we kind of end with, if that feels good. So if there are any questions, I will probably take one or two before we try this grand experiment. Like Chris is back there sort of like. Any questions, comments?
I have a question.
Take them down, NOMA is in the house.
Anyone else with a question?
I'll just say brilliant work, and I guess what was vibrating most in my head was thinking about your work. I always think of the work we take download does as being atomic level strategy and analysis of what organizing work looks like, because we want to tell what's happening in the street to symbolism, to ideology, and predicates the struggle in the first place. What I saw up there was on an aesthetic level, like this subatomic, manipulation of ideas that speak to where the thing comes from before the thing comes into fruition in the first place. So that scope is so macro and it's so far-reaching and wide. My question would be about, and you kind of spoke to it, but I guess I'm thinking about it in terms of detail. What does this look like in a practical sense and in the sense of practical? Because, when we take this kind of information, we want to go into schools, we want to give this to educators, we want to give this to organizers, and we want them to be able to attach it. And for symbols, they can walk through the streets and see, oh, bing, yeah, that. Oh, bing, yeah, that. And it's an immediate connect. Some of the stuff you were saying, I got 90% I like to think, but when the copper figure starts swimming around all that, that's like literally visually subatomic, and it's brilliant. And I'm wondering how, what those conversations really look like in Brazil. And Brazil, which is very now against the walls, and presents very similar challenges. I was in Salvador in December 2015, right the day after we had City Hall vote 6-1 to have these things removed, and they're still standing there for stuff that I can talk about later. But they had the same kind of layout. You got a statue of Zumbi, and then towering over Zumbi, you got a statue of some conquistador. So, and then you have a very Africanized public space that's still completely impoverished. You got to do is get one of those real history tours, as opposed to the tourist history tour, and you find out like that church was renovated for millions of dollars, and all these people still living in the shack. And so it's a dichotomy. It's really hard to navigate and balance. You got people in Lawrence, Claiborne Avenue, case in point, gentrified to no end, like urban renewal to no end, and yet still very Africanized. The painting. In a week or so, if not today, you're going to have Indians still marching right through there. And so I'm wondering what that looks like when you try to tell people in a very colonized state that their way is not completely, commensurate with its highest potential. And yeah, you can point that out. But what are maybe some of the ideas? What do those conversations sound like in Brazil? Because I'm really I've always struggled in my head, like, if we remove this, you got people like my mom who grew up right as that was coming up. That's their culture, right? So there's also the thing of like being a marginalized person living in a marginalized existence where you start to cling to whatever crumb was thrown to you. And God forbid you go into the community and tell them that's a crumb, So what does that conversation look like? Because it sounded like you had a success when you started to, and some of that stuff was very powerful. When you talk about the vegetation and the plant life, hundreds of millions of years ago, and you're talking about the preservation of African culture through Orishas, what have you, it lit up in my mind. Like, if you see the movie Avatar and how they had the blue black people, gravitating towards the trees, that's literally practically it comes out of, Yoruba ancestral spiritual traditions. And knowing about these traditions didn't right up until I heard what you say about the plants. So there's a lot of potential in the city to expand how we Africanize the public space. It's very easy to just identify the stuff that has to go. But what do some of those conversations look like? What are some of those visions?
Like I said, I thought it was a really important point to make about how the activists in Brazil wanted to just do something taller. Right. Because that's coming from what you're speaking about. That's what we know, that's what we recognize as having importance. It really took time. It was a really long, drawn-out process to say, because people were still like, okay, this is really great, but where's the memorial? Where's the monument? It was a process, and I think by the end obviously it wasn't just me saying all these things. I was learning from them, I was drawing from them, and in a similar way, just looking outside of the window, it's like New Orleans is all about the street, right? And I bring that up because this is a street. We circle the street, basically. And the way that this has been treated architecturally is very foreign. This is about the sky. And this little man is up in the sky. And that's not New Orleans spatial tradition. You know, the way that the landscaping around the base of the monument is very formalistic. There's really not a lot of, this is a huge traffic circle, there's really not a lot of space to occupy. And so I mean, you know, off the top of my head, I feel like this whole street from building face to building face in this circle is a thing. It's a space. And, you know, all you have to do is walk outside in New Orleans and see how you design something. People are all over the street. And so, you know, how does this thing not just become a thing you drive past, but really become a central space that gathers people? You don't just drive past it, but you want to be in that space. How do you, you know, we occupy spaces all the time. And so I think you could do something here that would redefine a traffic circle in a lot of ways. I think downgrading the vehicular movement and really prioritizing, I mean, this could be a really central space for people that, you know, it already wants to be that. It already is that, despite itself. Like, despite the design not really speaking to that, it is that. And I think supporting those traditions could be really powerful design move. And it's hard because it feels like you're taking something away. But I think, you know, even convincing ourselves that the way that we use space and the way that we memorialize through ritual is, you know, hard because we're in this colonized state, mental state, but I think would be really powerful in this way.
First of all, just a comment that Sarah's is brilliant, absolutely wonderful. And I say this as the old guy trying to design work. And I also know where you're educated too. But I want to ask you along the line of education, because a lot of what we presented here, I think, into the last exchange that you all just had, is about how you are taught about physical design and placement. And not to get too deep in the weeds, across the universities in America, you can have a whole range of how people look at what it is you do. Either it's a design statement, it's essentially trying to get on the cover magazine for collegiate colleges, or it's really looking, I think, at the much more sensitive and inflected aspects of built form and social response that you presented in your work tonight. And I'd like to just know, how much do you attribute your approach, your insight for analysis and execution with the way you learned this craft through your education? As opposed to, okay, well, it's nice what I learned there, but now I got out in the world, now I'm really opening it up. Now I understand what it has to be. Whatever you all taught, that was good to get a degree, but this is what I'm really about. Or did that education really help reinforce and calibrate and frame your sensitivity, your perspicacity, getting out here and approaching that?
That's an interesting question. I mean,
that's why I asked it.
I originally went to architecture school not thinking it would be able to speak to my interests, and just knowing that it was a skill set that I wanted to absorb and apply in a certain way. I entered landscape architecture school at a moment where ecology was really the driving force, and I think that for me actually powered a lot of how I was thinking, in the sense that it's systems-based, it's place-based inherently, and there's a lot of technologies. The animation stuff is being used a lot in ecology. So the skill set and the rhetoric ended up being supportive in a way that I wasn't expecting. And so I'm excited by where landscape architecture is going. I think they're thinking about ecology in a very scientific way, which is, I find problematic. Data isn't it's a problem. It's a problem to give too much, credence to that.
That's right.
Exactly. And so I'm hoping that this sort of discourse of culture can help balance the way we think about ecology, and then ecology becomes about people again.
Right.
But I'm excited about where the discipline is going. I found it to be supportive in a way I wasn't expecting. And keep your eye on landscape architecture, I think.
Oh, I do.
As a discipline.
Yeah. When I was trying to process what you were giving, my mind was seeing in dualities. I was seeing form and function. I was seeing aesthetics and semiology, and then I was trying to see this cultural awareness and something I just made up, the relevant existential relevance, and all of those framed, those dualities then took a leap to me in terms of dialectic. What's all of that mean? My grandkids, if there's not a language that can translate what you're doing now or make accessible to my great-grandkids, they may not be able to discern it. And so what I was wondering was whether or not you have, in an Einsteinian way, come up with a new math that explains what you've done that is transferable, so that others can, if they learn that, then they can know what you've done, and find a place that they can make a point of entry, so that a great-grandchild says, oh, okay, so this is what made that work, but the existential relevance thing has changed.
Right.
And so now I don't have a way in if I don't have a language, if I don't have a math, if I don't have a calculus. So I was wondering whether or not you had any thought about it.
I did, and it's something I struggle with, in the sense that I don't think the math or the language is the same in every place, you know, and so I think, you know, somebody asked me once, is it okay if somebody comes to this place and not know anything about it? Me personally, I feel that's fine, in the sense that if people go to the slave port and practice their capoeira, not knowing anything about this design, or sit at the bench and read what is on it, or play in the water, maybe that's okay that they don't know. Maybe that's okay, because why? They're in the space, they're participating in the ritual, they're there, their bodies are physically in space, and that's ultimately what this is about. And so part of me says, maybe the language of the math is, maybe we don't need it in the same way. Maybe that's what books are for, maybe that's what oral histories are for. But also, you know, if in a space or if in a society people feel the need for that, I think this is an apparatus for being very literal. All of these things can be plastered with plaques and plastered with all sorts of content or information, and it's all about what the people feel like they need. And as an architect, I feel like this is an armature, and then it becomes what people need it to become in their own way. I feel like I don't have an understanding. I can't speak the language or do the math of the people there beyond this point in a way. But I can be challenged on that, you know, if you guys have thoughts.
That raises to me Brian Lee's often made comment that architecture is the hardware to the software of life. It's kind of in the idea that we create the framework in which life exists, and that life can exist in everything from active resistance in the form of protest or political speech to just sitting on a bench reading a book. And my question was already
Well, it seems like there might be an opportunity for us to pose the rest of these questions in this kind of kaleidoscope format, and for us to kind of experiment with what it means to kind of be in space right now collectively. So I know that there were some hands, but I hope that you share those questions. I'm going to really quickly just kind of go over the general rules, which are just that you're not responding to any question with an answer, that the questions don't have to relate in any particular way, so you don't have to, there doesn't have to be any sort of rhizomatic response, and that really this is about a tool of active listening and about a collective process. It's not a tool for creating a solution. So if we're kind of ready, silence is okay, space in between questions is okay. I think if you're ready, then we'll try it together.
Okay.
I'll throw out the first question. Why is it important for us to think about equity, white supremacist capitalism, when we're thinking about space in this country and the Americas?
I respond to that question.
Anyone can respond to the question.
You just talk. To the inverse of the previous question, if community members are using space and not knowing its history, is that okay versus when people with a history of oppression or of being the oppressor uses space and not know the history, is that equally okay, or is that then the problem?
Are we saying that ethnicity or language in history is not a built environment?
Why do we frame questions in terms of having or not having in terms of money?
Why don't enough people feel like they're being heard or that their voices don't matter?
How do you create a multicultural narrative?
How can we use technology to eliminate menial labor and recreate or reimagine the way we think about our spaces of living and working?
Why can't the gentrified become the gentry?
How come there are more black people in design schools? How do we move beyond resistance and go into creating something new?
Why aren't there more black people in this room?
Is creation just an exercise of unearthing history, or is it creating something completely original?
Can you address the circle without addressing some immediate neighbors with greater development foundation or the Tulane Foundation?
Can we honor heroes in the last through time, or are they all doomed to fall out of favor as our society progresses? Is there a way to choose these folks so that they have the long-lasting recognition of achievement that means meaningful for the future?
Is equality even attainable?
Why does local government attack legislation for DBEs?
How do we make the civic process easier for more people to participate?
How do we design the city taking into consideration intended development capacity?
Why does the streetcar not have air conditioning?
Why is the streetcar not wheelchair accessible?
Is any person worthy of a monument, or are we better off exalting principle and ethos? Worship. Who benefits, who pays, and who decides?
How do we design for those who don't participate or aren't able to?
there's so many nonprofits in New Orleans all fighting for the same grant money?
Why are there so many nonprofits in New Orleans?
How can we get more people in this room in local government?
How can we get more Claiborne Corridor residents in this room? Why don't we always have residents in the room when we're talking about their neighborhood and their community?
Why are we having this conversation in that neighborhood?
Why can't we talk about the nonprofit industrial complex?
Why can't 501c3 just take stances on political issues?
Why can't 501c3s pay property taxes?
How do we allow ourselves time for discomfort?
How can space generate healing between cultures?
How do you guys support those that already do without having?
How can we better align our personal and professional goals and objectives? So I'm going to ask that we take a collective breath in. Some of you were skeptical, I know, but we got through it together. I encourage you to, if you think that this way of having a collective conversation could be useful, to look up kaleidoscope conversations. They're happening in the organizing world, they're happening in the art world. We're really trying to kind of change the way that we are interacting, but also trying to give space to be reflective, which many times in our busy lives we don't have an opportunity to do. So maybe we give one last sort of round of applause for Tulane, for AIA, and of course for Sara Zewde.
And on behalf of myself and Jaws 2 and the world, I guess, thank you all so much. This is, I think, kind of an unprecedented conversation to happen in this space in exactly this way. I think that's reflective of how things can be changing in the architecture design world if we show up and if we have these conversations. Because architecture doesn't have to be a force that reinforces white supremacy by putting little racist men on pedestals. We can take that whole system apart through architecture, through these kinds of conversations, and in our own lives as well. So thanks for showing up.